A winter night in Dustmere Valley. The year was 1883. Amidst the thick snow, a lone figure staggered forward, her bare feet pressing against the freezing ice. In her arms, she cradled a young Apache boy, around 5 years old, his body burning with fever. His breath so faint it seemed on the verge of vanishing. She had no idea how far she had walked. All she knew was, if she stopped, the child would die. A dim light flickering from a cabin at the end of the valley became her final hope. She knocked, not once, but 3 times, each one weaker than the last. Inside, Caleb Ross was jolted awake. He opened the door and froze. Standing before him was an exhausted Apache woman, her face pale, her deep black eyes like endless chasms. She collapsed at the doorstep, kneeling before a complete stranger. "I will trade my body. My child needs a father. Please, save him." Her voice cracked, part plea, part final cry for help. Caleb said nothing. In that moment, he saw himself in the child's eyes, a fragile soul clinging to life. And even though he had sworn never to let anyone into his world again, his arms reached out, lifting the boy and helping the mother to her feet. The cabin door closed behind them, not just to keep out the cold wind, but to shut away the past. He had no idea what would come next. All he knew was, tonight, perhaps his life had just taken a different turn. Inside the small cabin, the warmth from the fireplace slowly began to push back the biting cold that gnawed at the bones. The child was laid down on a wooden bed near the fire, a thick blanket pulled up to his neck. Caleb sat beside him, every so often placing his calloused hand on the boy's forehead, burning hot, a high fever. Each weak breath from the boy dragged Caleb back to a memory he had buried deep, his own little daughter. Once lying on this very same bed, burning with fever, and never waking up. The Apache woman sat silently in the corner of the room, her dark eyes fixed on her son, as if afraid that looking away would make him vanish. No words were exchanged. Outside, the wind howled like a mourning cry, while inside, the air was thick with silence and the tension of 2 worlds that had just collided, one man who had lost everything, and one mother desperate to escape her own personal hell. As the night wore on, Caleb changed the cold cloth one last time. The boy let out a faint whimper. It was such a small sound, but it brought both adults to a halt. The mother burst into tears. Caleb looked up at her not with the gaze of a stranger, but with the eyes of someone who knew too well the terror of losing someone you love. The next morning, snow still blanketed the world outside. But inside the cabin, a new rhythm of life had begun. The woman, whose name was Nayeli, rose early to light the fire and made a thin soup using what little dried food remained. She scrubbed the wooden floor and patched the torn curtain, not out of gratitude but because her heart would not allow her to sit still when the man before her had saved her son's life. Caleb did not stop her. He simply watched in silence, keeping his distance. But each small gesture, the way she bowed her head slightly as she handed him a bowl of soup, the way she whispered lullabies in Apache, as she rocked her son to sleep, each of those began to slip past the hardened shell he had built around his heart for so many years. On the second day, the boy opened his eyes fully. He looked around, dazed, then stopped at Caleb and let out a soft, clumsy sound, half a call, half a breath. Caleb froze, feeling as if time itself had stopped. That sound, so achingly close to the way his daughter once said "Pa" before leaving this world, cracked something deep inside him. From that moment on, the cabin was no longer just a place of shelter. It became a quiet space where 2 souls, 2 griefs, 2 pasts that never should have crossed, began to orbit around a fragile little life that was slowly coming back. No words were needed, no promises spoken, only the breath of the child, the crackling of fire, and an invisible thread slowly weaving itself between 2 hearts that had once been shattered. A week had passed since that fateful snowy night. The boy was healthy now, running around the cabin with a sparkle in his eyes and laughter that danced in the firelight, a sound Caleb had not heard in what felt like a lifetime. Nayeli was still there, quietly tending to everything as if this place had always been her home. They spoke no words about the future, and never named the strange bond that was slowly forming between them. But they both knew. Something had changed forever. One cold gray afternoon, as Caleb was chopping firewood on the porch, The sound of hooves shattered the stillness. He looked up, and his heart clenched. Riding toward the cabin was Clara, the woman who had once been his wife, the one who left after their daughter died. Her face was unchanged, composed, distant, and stirring up memories he had tried for years to bury. "I heard you were living out here alone," Clara said, her eyes drifting toward the half-open door. "We could start over, if you want to." The offer felt like a blade pressed to a wound that had never healed. Caleb said nothing. In that moment, he realized his heart was no longer hollow like it had been the day Clara walked away. There was a new rhythm now, fragile, but real, beating every time he heard the laughter of the child inside. Clara turned her horse and left, knowing there was no longer a place for her. But she had not yet vanished beyond the trees when another figure appeared, not a ghost from Caleb's past, but from Nayeli's blood-stained history. A group of 3 Apache men emerged at the edge of the woods. Leading them was Toma, a towering man with fire in his eyes, the man Nayeli once trusted, and the one who betrayed her. When he saw her step out onto the porch, Toma dismounted, his voice rough like thunder. "You have betrayed your own blood. You ran to this white man and threw away the honor of your people. Come back now, before we drag you like the disgrace you have become." Nayeli stood still, offering no defense. Caleb saw her hands tremble, and her eyes darken like old shadows rising to the surface. She had told him very little about her past, but in that gaze, he saw the pain of someone used, discarded, and broken like a worthless thing. "You do not belong in his world," Toma continued, his voice growing harsher. "Return before something worse happens." Caleb stepped out onto the porch, his eyes calm but unyielding. "She is not something to be taken. She has the right to choose her own life." Toma gave a cold smile, then spat on the ground. "Choice. Let us see what she chooses when everyone turns their back on her." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving behind a heavy silence. Inside the cabin, Nayeli sat motionless by the window. Her hands clenched so tightly they had started to bleed. Caleb did not ask anything. He simply sat beside her, his quiet presence, a vow that he would remain no matter what came back to tear their world apart. Outside, the snow still fell, but inside their hearts, another storm was beginning to gather, a storm of memory, betrayal, and the fear of losing what they had only just begun to find. That night, the fire in the hearth burned higher than usual, its light sweeping across the worn wooden walls and casting a warm glow on 2 silent faces sitting across from each other. There was no more howling wind outside, only the heavy stillness between 2 people carrying past like scars that would never fully heal. Nayeli sat curled up by the window, her eyes gazing into the dark unknown beyond. She had been silent for hours since Toma left, as if something inside her was screaming, yet locked so deep it could not escape. At last, her voice rose soft, fragile, as though afraid of the very words about to be spoken. "I once trusted him," she said, not looking at Caleb. "I believed Toma would protect me, but I was only a tool in his hands. When I carried his child, he turned his back. He said the baby was a burden, that a woman like me did not deserve to be loved." Caleb was still. Her story was not unfamiliar. He too had heard something similar from the woman he once loved. "You are not the only one who was left behind," Caleb said, his voice rough. "My wife walked away when our daughter died. She was not even 5 years old. I held her in my arms until her last breath, and then the woman I thought would stay with me until the end of my days vanished from my life like she had never been there at all." They looked at each other, no longer with the cautious eyes of strangers, but with the gaze of 2 souls who had just exposed their deepest wounds. The room seemed to draw closer around them, and the warmth did not come only from the fire but from the deep understanding slowly spreading between them. In the nights that followed, they spoke more, about what they had lost, about dreams that had shattered, about fears they had never dared to name. Nayeli shared stories of her childhood among the tribe, of the dry seasons and the harsh life on the frontier. Caleb spoke of the grassy fields where his daughter once played, of the house that fell into ruin after his wife left. Each story was a brick laid in a bridge between 2 worlds, and on the 7th night since their fateful meeting, as they sat together by the fire, the boy ran up, climbed onto Caleb's lap, and said his first clear word, "Pa." No one said anything. but Caleb's eyes filled with tears. He wrapped his arms around the child, then looked over at Nayeli. Her eyes had softened, her lips trembled. In that moment, they were no longer two strangers thrown together by fate. They were a family unnamed, unspoken, but bound by a thread that could no longer be undone. Outside, the night sky was blanketed in stars. And for the first time in many years, Caleb did not feel alone. Thank you for being here. If this story brought back memories of dusty afternoons and the echo of hoofbeats in your heart, subscribe to my channel, so each day we can sit together again. And I will tell you another tale from the west. Winter still showed no signs of retreat. The winds from the northern mountains swept through in long, biting waves, bringing a bone-deep chill that covered the Dustmere Valley. But Caleb's small wooden cabin was no longer just a place to shelter from the cold. It had become a true home, where three once lonely souls had found a reason to keep going. Each morning, Nayeli rose early to stoke the fire and prepare breakfast. Caleb took the boy outside, teaching him how to feed the horses, how to split firewood, and how to listen to the wind to predict the weather. Every now and then, when he turned his head, he would catch Nayeli standing by the window, smiling at the sight, an honest, gentle smile he had not seen in all the years spent living in the shadows. And so the days slipped by, one after another, and the fragile thread connecting them began to strengthen into something unbreakable. But there were things that could not stay hidden forever. The lingering glances that lasted a little too long, the touches that happened by accident, and lingered just a moment more than they should have. Something had changed, something warm and slow burning, like glowing embers waiting for a breeze to become fire. One night, a snowstorm came suddenly. The wind screamed through the cracks in the walls like the cry of a wild beast. The fire in the hearth burned high, casting a soft, golden light that wrapped around the entire room. The boy was already fast asleep under a thick blanket, his breathing steady like the heartbeat of a small family. Caleb sat at the wooden table, his eyes settling on Nayeli as she sewed by the fire. Her black hair fell over her strong shoulders, and her sun-kissed skin shimmered in the firelight, a vision so quietly powerful, so gentle and fierce at once, that he could not look away. "Big storm," Caleb said softly, as if trying not to disturb the peace. "Yes," Nayeli replied, her voice just as quiet as the wind, "but it is warm in here." He was silent for a moment, then stood and pulled another blanket over the bed. "The bed is wider than you think," he said, looking straight at her. "Share it with me, not because it is cold, but because, from now on, we do not have to be alone anymore." For a moment, time seemed to stop. Nayeli said nothing. She simply stood and walked slowly toward the bed. When she lay down beside him, the space between them melted away. They were no longer just two drifters seeking shelter from the winter. They were two hearts finally finding their way to one another. That night, they did not share a bed out of necessity. They lay beside each other for something far deeper, a feeling that had grown beyond gratitude, beyond fear, into something neither of them had dared to name for years. And when Caleb gently took her hand in his, the fire in the hearth seemed to blaze brighter, just like the fire inside two hearts that had been frozen for far too long. A few weeks later, Nayeli realized she was carrying new life. But instead of fear, her heart overflowed with hope. In that little wooden cabin, a family was coming together not out of blood or duty, but out of love and choice. Late-season snow continued to fall silently over Dustmere Valley, laying a blanket of white across the roof of the old cabin. Life had seemed finally settled until that morning, when the sound of hooves echoed once more along the same trail where Nayeli had first appeared. But this time, it was not just 3 or 4 riders. Leading the group was Toma, and behind him rode nearly a dozen armed strangers, along with a few townsfolk Caleb had once greeted when buying salt or iron nails. They stopped at the wooden fence. Toma's eyes burned like fire. "Caleb Ross," he shouted, "you are keeping what belongs to us. A woman kidnapped, a child held against his will. Today, I am here to take them back." The entire valley fell silent. Caleb stepped off the porch, no gun in hand, no knife drawn. Just a man in a worn coat, his face etched with loss, but his eyes steady and unafraid. "She was not kidnapped," Caleb said calmly. "She is here because she chose to stay. And the child has a home here, if he wants it. Those simple words struck like a spark tossed onto dry timber. The crowd murmured. Someone scoffed. Another spat on the ground. A man from the town stepped forward. Indians and white men cannot live together. You are standing against this entire community. Caleb remained silent for a moment, then turned to look at Nayeli. She stepped through the doorway, the boy clutching her hand, his eyes no longer filled with fear. In a deep, steady voice, she spoke. No one made me stay. I have been abandoned, betrayed, treated like a possession. But here, for the first time, I have lived as a human being. The air grew thick. A few looked down, unable to meet her eyes. An old woman in the crowd stepped forward, glancing at Caleb, then at the child. She let out a quiet sigh. If this is his home, then maybe we have no right to tear it away from him. Silence held for nearly a minute, spreading from one person to the next, like a strange, invisible breeze. The hatred in their eyes began to fade, replaced by hesitation, and slowly, acceptance. Toma looked around and saw the support slipping from his grasp. You will regret this, he hissed. But the fire in his voice had dimmed. Then he yanked the reins and turned his horse, riding off as the snow crunched beneath his iron shoes. The field returned to stillness. Caleb stood there long after the group disappeared from view. There had been no blood, no bullets, but in that moment, he knew they had won. Not with weapons, but with courage and love. That night, as Nayeli rested her head on his shoulder beside the fire, Caleb understood something. The past had finally loosened its grip, and ahead of them stretched a new road, one where they no longer had to run, but could live, truly live, by the choices of their hearts. Winter had finally begun to retreat from Dustmere Valley. The biting winds had softened, leaving behind a strange and peaceful stillness. The little cabin was no longer a refuge for three lonely souls. It had become a true home, where the past stopped at the doorstep and the future knocked quietly from within. Each morning, Nayeli sat by the window, her hands resting on a belly that grew fuller with each passing week. In the gentle light of dawn, she was no longer the trembling Apache woman who had once knocked on Caleb's door during a snowstorm. She was now a mother, a partner, and most importantly, a woman who had chosen her own path. Caleb worked quietly by the horse stable, mending fences and clearing away the last of the snow. And every time he looked up, the sight of Nayeli and the boy laughing together on the porch felt like something out of a dream, one he had once thought would never return after losing his family years ago. On a night in early March, as the last snow melted from the hills, a clear, sharp cry echoed from inside the cabin. A healthy child was born, her tiny hands wrapping around Caleb's finger as if she had always known this place was home. Nayeli lay exhausted on the bed, tears streaming down her cheeks, not from pain, but from a joy so deep it could not be named. The Apache boy stood by the bedside, his eyes wide with wonder as he looked at his newborn sibling. "My little sister," he whispered in broken English, then turned to Caleb and called him by the name that had become part of him now. Pa. A few weeks later, as the first spring breeze drifted through the pine trees, Caleb placed an old silver ring on the wooden table, the only thing left from his grandfather's time. He knelt in front of Nayeli, not with grand words, but with the most honest look a man could give the woman he loved. "No ceremony could bind us more than what we have already lived through," he said quietly. "But if you will have me, I would like to call you my wife." Nayeli was silent for a moment, then slowly nodded. Her smile was not bright like fire, it was gentle like the sun after a storm. The kind of light that only appears once someone has truly passed through the dark. A few days later, by a half-frozen stream, they held a small ceremony. No priest, no white dress, just a few neighbors, the boy holding the silver ring, and two people who had once been strangers, now standing as a family. When Caleb placed the ring on Nayeli's hand, the spring wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a silent blessing. From that moment on, they were no longer two worlds colliding. They were one, a family not born of blood, but built through trust, love, and the will to move forward together. Spring came early that year in Dustmere Valley. The last ribbons of snow melted away, revealing the rich brown earth beneath the pines. On the hills surrounding the valley, young grass pushed up through the once frozen ground, and the wind no longer carried the sting of ice, but the scent of life. For Caleb, it was not just another spring, it was the beginning of a life he never thought he would live again. The little cabin that once sheltered a lonely man had changed completely. The wooden fence was rebuilt, stronger than before, and the horse stable now held a few newborn foals. Nayeli had planted rows of fresh green vegetables by the porch, and the Apache boy ran laughing through the yard, chasing a little dog Caleb had brought home from town. In Nayeli's arms, the newborn baby slept soundly, her breath as light as the spring wind drifting through the doorway. Each day, Caleb rose early and went out to the fields. He built a new storage shed and repaired the trail leading from the cabin to the stream. And each time he came home, what met his eyes was no longer cold wooden walls and silence, but a warm meal. Soft eyes waiting for him, and the sound of small feet running to greet him at the door. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the whole family sat together on the porch steps. The older boy cradled his baby sister, his face glowing in the golden twilight. Nayeli leaned her head on Caleb's shoulder, her gaze fixed on the horizon painted in red, the very same horizon where they had once stood alone, empty and lost. Now, they stood there together. "I used to think my heart was dead," Caleb said softly, eyes still on the sunset. "I thought I would live the rest of my life in silence and shadow. But it turns out, it was just waiting for a warm enough hand to wake it up." Nayeli took his hand and smiled. "And now, we will never let it fall asleep again." The spring wind swept gently through the valley, carrying the smell of fresh earth and the distant murmur of running water. The past, its losses, betrayals, judgments, and fears was now just a memory. What remained was the present, a simple home, a family held together by love and choice, and a future with something worth waking up for each day. As night fell, the fire in the cabin burned bright once more, casting light on 3 souls and 1 sleeping child. It was no longer a shelter from the storm, no longer a resting place for 2 wandering hearts. It was a true home, a place where life began again, and broken hearts beat as one. Out here on this dry land, guns may keep a man alive, but only love keeps the heart alive. Hatred can make a man survive, but only grace lets him truly live. There are wounds we think will never heal until someone takes our hand and says, "I am not going anywhere." And in that moment, something incredible happens. A heart that once turned to ice begins to beat again. It is truly wonderful to have you here, my cherished audience of Wild West storytelling. I sincerely hope you are safe and happy wherever life finds you. I love every one of you. Tell me what you thought about this story. Leave a comment down below. Type the number 1 if you enjoyed this story. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more dramatic tales from the Wild West.